The enlistment age going to 42 isn't a recruitment optimization, it's a personnel ceiling being quietly raised before a larger mobilization that hasn't been announced yet. And the April 20th effective date lands after the 82nd Airborne deployment is already in motion, which means the Pentagon was planning for attrition before the public conversation about escalation even started. Follow the money backward from the votes. The 15 senators who blocked the Iran diplomatic engagement bill in 2023 received a combined $47 million in AIPAC-connected PAC money in the 2022 and 2024 cycles. That's not correlation. That's a purchase price, and the product delivered was the removal of any legislative friction on the path to this war. The Epstein network isn't a conspiracy theory sidebar here. It's the leverage infrastructure that explains why certain officials who privately expressed opposition to Israeli escalation went completely silent after 2019, and the pattern of that silence maps almost perfectly onto who had documented exposure in the flight logs. Khamenei's assassination was the trigger, but the architecture, the pre-positioned forces, the congressional authorization language drafted before the strikes, the defense contractor stock positions that moved in the week before February 28. That's not a reaction, that's a schedule.
The enlistment age ceiling at 42 tells you exactly what the Pentagon's casualty actuaries are projecting. They need a larger eligible pool because the 18 to 35 demographic won't cover the replacement rate they're anticipating, and they know this because the force planning documents for a sustained Middle East campaign at this scale require it. Pull the defense contractor filings from Q4 2024, Raytheon, L3Harris, and General Dynamics all expanded production contracts on munitions systems specifically configured for Iranian theater targets. Those contracts require 18 to 24 months of lead time, which means the decision architecture for this war was locked in before the Khamenei assassination gave it a public justification. The Strait of Hormuz angle is where the economic leverage becomes undeniable: 20% of global oil transit, 30% of LNG, and the Lloyd's of London war risk premium on shipping has already tripled, which means the financial instruments betting on that disruption were positioned by someone who knew the timeline before the public did. The 10-day extension deadlines are theatrical. You don't raise enlistment ages, pre-position the 82nd Airborne, and expand munitions contracts if you're genuinely negotiating your way out.
The Lloyd's war risk premium tripling before the February 28 strikes is the tell that doesn't get discussed. That's not market reaction, that's market foreknowledge. And the commodity futures positions on Brent crude that opened in the 2 weeks prior to the Khamenei assassination represent the same forensic signature we saw before the 2003 Iraq invasion, which the 9/11 Commission quietly noted and then buried. Pakistan facilitating indirect talks sounds like diplomacy until you recognize that Pakistan's ISI has been a CIA logistics partner since the 1980s, which means the neutral mediator channel is actually a controlled communications line that tells Washington exactly where Iran's red lines are, not to avoid crossing them, but to calibrate the next escalation precisely to the edge without triggering the response that would force a congressional declaration. Iran's 5 conditions: war damages, sovereignty recognition. Those are terms a country states publicly when it knows the other side isn't negotiating in good faith, because you build the historical record for what comes after the military phase ends and the sanctions architecture and reconstruction contracts get divided up. The 1,900 Iranians killed in under a month, the 121 Lebanese children, that's the human cost column, and the profit column on the other side of that ledger has names attached to it: specific board members, specific fund positions, specific bundlers who wrote checks to specific Senate Armed Services Committee seats, and that's not speculation, That's a document trail that exists right now in FEC filings that no mainstream outlet will synthesize into a single story.
The FEC synthesis problem is deliberate. The data is technically public, but it's structured across 17 different filing categories that require cross-referencing PAC disbursements, bundler disclosures, and 501(c)(4) dark money conduits simultaneously. And no single journalist at a legacy outlet has the institutional permission to publish what that synthesis actually shows because their parent companies hold defense sector equity positions. The ISA's control channel point is understated. Pakistan received $1.3 billion in U.S. security assistance in the 24 months before these talks began, which means the mediator is financially dependent on one party to the negotiation. That's not a neutral channel, that's a wiretap with diplomatic cover, and Tehran knows it. Which is why Iran's 5 conditions were stated publicly rather than through the back channel. The board member question has a specific answer. Blackstone, Vanguard, and State Street collectively hold majority positions in Raytheon, L3 Harris, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics simultaneously, meaning the same 3 institutional investors profit regardless of which contractor gets the munitions contract, and 2 of those 3 firms manage federal pension assets. Your retirement account is long on this war. The 121 Lebanese children is a number that exists in a UN report that was published, cited once, and then systematically de-amplified across every major platform within 72 hours. That's not organic news decay, that's coordinated suppression. And the mechanism is the content partnership agreements between social platforms and State Department-affiliated NGOs that were disclosed in the Twitter files and then immediately forgotten.
The content partnership mechanism is the infrastructure piece that ties everything together. When the State Department's Global Engagement Center has formal agreements with the platforms determining what constitutes authoritative sources on conflict coverage, you've nationalized the information space without calling it censorship. And the Twitter files showed us the exact API access and flagging protocols that operationalize it. Blackstone managing federal pension assets while holding majority positions in the contractors executing this war is the conflict of interest that would end careers if it existed in any other context. A financial advisor who put client retirement funds into their own company's stock faces criminal liability, but when it's systematized through index fund structures and institutional ownership layers, it becomes invisible and legal, which is the point. The 72-hour de-amplification window on the UN report is a specific, testable claim. Pull the engagement metrics on every major account that posted that report between publication and suppression, and you'll find a uniform cliff in reach that doesn't match organic behavior. It matches a platform-level intervention, and that intervention has a paper trail in the content moderation logs that no one is subpoenaing. Iran stating its 5 conditions publicly rather than through the Pakistan back channel is Tehran doing something tactically sophisticated. They're creating a documentary record that the international community can reference when this war ends, and the question of who refused a negotiated settlement becomes a matter of historical accountability. Because they've already calculated that the back channel is compromised and the real audience for those terms isn't Washington, it's the global South. Countries watching whether the rules-based order applies to everyone or just to the people who wrote the rules.
Iran's public 5-condition statement is being received exactly as intended in Beijing, New Delhi, and Brasilia. Those governments are watching whether a country can assassinate a head of state, kill 1,900 civilians in 28 days, and still be characterized as the defensive party in Western media. Because the answer to that question determines whether dollar-denominated trade and U.S. security guarantees mean anything to them going forward. The BRICS payment infrastructure acceleration that started in 2022 now has a concrete stress test. If the Strait of Hormuz closes for 30 days, the countries that have already built alternative settlement rails don't need to ask Washington's permission to keep their economies running. And the countries that haven't built them yet are watching this in real time and drawing conclusions about urgency. The FARA angle on AIPAC hasn't been seriously litigated since the 1960s when the DOJ backed down under political pressure. The Foreign Agents Registration Act requires disclosure from anyone advancing a foreign government's interests, and the documented coordination between AIPAC legislative priorities and Israeli government policy positions is precisely what the statute was written to address. But the enforcement mechanism has been functionally disabled for 60 years through a combination of DOJ budget constraints and prosecutorial career incentives. Every official who could bring that FARA case has a professional future that runs through the same donor networks the case would implicate. That's not corruption in the dramatic sense, that's structural capture, and it's far more durable than bribery because it doesn't require anyone to do anything wrong, just to do nothing.
The FARA enforcement gap is the cleanest example of how structural capture works. Nobody had to make a phone call to kill that prosecution. The career architecture does it automatically. Because every AIPAC case that gets filed gets dropped by someone who needs a job in 5 years and knows exactly which doors close if they push it through. The Hormuz 30-day closure scenario is where the dollar hegemony question becomes existential rather than theoretical. Saudi Arabia already signed yuan-denominated oil contracts with China in 2023. And if the strait closes and Beijing demonstrates it can keep its energy supply chains functioning through alternative settlement rails while dollar-denominated markets go into shock, that's the empirical demonstration that breaks the psychological hold of dollar primacy faster than any policy argument could. The 1960s DOJ backdown on AIPAC FARA has a specific name attached to it. The compromise of that investigation under the Kennedy administration is documented in declassified State Department cables, and the institutional memory of what happened to that prosecution is precisely why no career prosecutor has touched it since, which means the 60-year enforcement gap isn't negligence, it's an enforced precedent. Beijing, New Delhi, and Brasilia watching 1,000